we're recording. I think everybody's here, so let's get going. Welcome, everybody. This is the Kubernetes Cluster API Azure Office Hours. It's April 15th, 2021. Cluster API and Cluster API Azure Provider are sub-projects of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, Kubernetes area. As always, please try and use the Zoom feature to raise your hand so that we don't stump on each other, and follow the Kubernetes rules of conduct, which is essentially just everybody be polite. I think that's, oh, and please put your name in the attendees list if you have a minute to do that. We don't have any special recurring topics. Do we have anybody new who hasn't been here before and wants to introduce themselves?
Sure. I have not attended this meeting before. My name is Kenny Woodson. I think I've worked with, I think it's Cecile at Microsoft. I worked on the Arrow project, the Azure Red Hat OpenShift project in the very beginning with her. Yeah, since then I've moved into a platform position here at Red Hat and focusing on Azure. So any Azure related topics and things I've been kind of overseeing and trying to assist our engineering team. So I thought I would attend and see what this meeting was about and try to keep tabs.
Excellent. Welcome.
I will go next. So my name is Eugene. So actually, I attended part of the meeting like a couple of weeks ago, but didn't introduce myself. So I'm working for CSE team, focusing on DevOps and infrastructure. CSE stands for Commercial Software Engineering. So currently we are focused on GitOps practices for cloud native applications, and actually copy and KABZ is on our radar currently, in conjunction with the multi-cluster setup for GitOps operations. And we are investigating deeply using copy and KABZ for provisioning AKS clusters following secure AKS baseline. So actually, we are positioning that as a powerful approach to set up your multi-cluster and multi-tenancy fleet with copy and KABZ in a fully GitOps fashion, so that we don't have any push-based IC pipelines, and everything is done just declaratively, following just pure pull-based GitOps practice. So we keep digging into this area, and actually I created an issue with some gaps between secure AKS baseline and what we can do with copy. So yeah, following this topic, and I think that we will attend these meetings like every now and then.
Great. Yeah, bring it on. More CSE, the better. Cool. Anybody have any questions for Kenny or Eugene? Did I remember your names correctly?
Yep, correct.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, I think we're on to open discussion now. We have a couple PSAs. Go ahead, Cecile.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, just really quick ones. First of all, the 0414 release is out, and that fixes a bug that was basically there was different in formatting between our provider ID format and the cluster autoscalers. So we've changed ours to align with cluster autoscaler and also cloud provider. So you'll notice the 3 slashes now instead of 4 slashes. Very minor difference, but makes a big difference in practice. So that fixes a bug if you're using cluster autoscaler. And then the second one I have is Shyam, who's actually here in the meeting, is now a reviewer for KABZ. So I wanted to thank Shyam for all his work and
That's awesome.
Good job.
Any questions on those two?
All important slash. Crazy. Cool. All right. Next, Christian wants to talk about the E2E test for Azure Bastion feature. Go for it.
Yeah, I know it's a deep technical topic, but maybe it's quicker to reach consensus if we talk about it. So I have a PR open about implementing the Azure Bastion feature, and there has been some discussion around the end-to-end test, if and where to add the end-to-end test to check that this specific feature works. And there we didn't reach consensus on GitHub about where to put it, basically. So maybe we can have a quick discussion about this. I feel like to answer your question, Cecile, on GitHub, the question was when this feature is more useful, in which kind of scenarios, which kind of clusters. And I think the clusters that have private networking only, so they don't expose the nodes with public IPs, I feel like that's the more natural usage of Azure Bastion. But yeah, if anybody has any idea about it, I'm happy to hear.
Anybody have any comments? Oh, Cecile, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious what David meant when David, you said on the PR that we should consider adding it to the default template. Was that the default template for testing or the default template for like users?
Like the default flavor.
Okay, so at some point, this was so much more than I wrote down. So I was thinking at some point the default should probably be default to a secure cluster with a bastion, and an insecure cluster should be something opt into. The default, at some point, it would be nice if we could get that closer to best practices, rather than, hey, here is something that leaves you open to problems. Like, here's what we think you should be having, not here's the simplest thing. And I'm not sure if that really makes sense. Should we just have like a simple template? Like, here's simple, instead of default, and then default is, hey, this is what you should have. I don't know. That's the only point of contention. You saying put in default for the test flavor, I totally back. I think that's awesome, and it achieves our goal, and we don't have to make another flavor for it. So double cool. That was just my thought on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That makes sense. I agree with you, but I don't think this PR is the good place to change our best practice default. But I think for me, what makes the most sense is to add it to the private cluster template by default, and then use that to test it, since that's a use case where you'd want that by default probably, and also like it allows us to test it without adding yet another test flavor. And I think that's what we want to achieve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Cool.
I totally hear what David's saying too, that the default should be something that, you know, reflects what we want people to actually use for cluster configuration. The challenge is, you know, the sort of hurdle to adoption. You know, how hard is it to use that default? And if that's the default setup, you know, maybe we should have a simple and a default. I kind of agree with David on that. But I agree that it's not, you know, it's a totally orthogonal to this particular PR.
I think there's definitely a difference between what is best practice and what we want people to use during the quick start. And as like the first cluster, that should be the easiest, like simplest one. And then we definitely need like another thing that defines best practices.
think the best practices work is also related to what our friend from CSE here is working on. So maybe that's a better place to address what is default.
Cool. So Kristen, does that clarify enough for you where?
Yes,
land?
totally. Thanks.
Cool. Any other comments? All right. I just thought of a couple things I should mention, so I guess I'll go next. Let me do these in the opposite order because this one, there's not much to talk about. Just as always, we're trying to build the reference images for Kubernetes patches that dropped yesterday, or actually very early this morning is when they really came out. And running into a couple build issues and this image builder thing that I worked with Cecile with previously, but isn't quite fixed. So long story short, it'll probably be tomorrow just because there's some farbling we're doing, but I hopefully nobody's waiting for those eagerly. But it's in progress. And then a couple meetings ago, I mentioned that I was working on what I call the AZ CAPI extension. And so essentially this is an extension to the AZ CLI that tries to simplify the CAPZ experience and give you kind of a one-liner that does all the setup and all that stuff. There's some other goals there. It's not that far along, but I think it's at a point where it's sort of an MVP. So I was going to do a release next Tuesday or Monday and try and get feedback. But since we're not going to have a meeting for a couple of weeks, I thought I would put it in here and drop the URL in here in case anybody's actually interested in checking it out. I would love any feedback you have at this point because it's very early on. Such a lovely URL. That's where it is. And so hopefully by our next meeting, I can do a little more substantial demo or present some of the feedback that hopefully we've gotten from the community. Any questions about that?
Thank you for doing that, Matt.
Sure, it's been kind of slow motion, but I think there's still a lot of value there. We'll see. That's all we have on the topic list. Anything last minute people thought of? Cecile, you got your hand up. Sorry, it's hard for me to see the
No worries.
UI.
I'm just going to ask the obvious question. When should I use AZ CAPI? When should I use Clusterctl? Should I use both together? How does that work?
The idea with AZ CAPI is you'd never touch any of the other helper commands, that you can be somewhat ignorant of them and it'll download them when it needs them and it'll shell out to them when it needs them. So I'm trying to make myself use AZ CAPI for everything I do. But it's not 100% there. But the idea, I guess, would be it can be a total replacement for Clusterctl, kubectl, kind, and those, or at least you don't have to mess with those commands directly. David.
Thank you. Sorry, I was fumbling to get to the hand button. Okay, so it's interesting to hear that you're trying to use this for all your cluster interactions. What is the benefit? Like, what do you get out of it? Like, why?
Well, I'm doing that simply because I'm dog fooding my own code, obviously, and testing it. You get a consistent interface. If you're really used to AZ and the way it behaves, these commands are consistent with that in that, they expect JSON to come back from almost every command, and then they can format it a variety of ways. There's some behaviors to the AZ CLI you might be used to, but mostly you can just say AZ CAPI create with a couple of arguments, and it does everything for you and returns after CNI has been installed and some of the nodes are actually ready and all that. Whereas you probably know right now, there's several steps in there that require a human to kind of pull and go, well, is it ready? Oh, did I forget to install CNI? Oh, is it working now? Okay, now I can actually deploy a workload. The goal here is there's at least a one-line command that, takes several minutes, because it does. But when it returns, you can actually go ahead and deploy a manifest to the cluster. That's the major simplification. The other advantages are it cross-cuts flavors, or you can do mix and match of features, whereas right now flavors are, each of them is kind of a silo or an island on its own. And if you want to combine IPv6 with Windows node pools or ephemeral disks or something like that, it would be a little bit of a cut and paste exercise for you to do in the YAML, but that wouldn't be the case with the CLI, with the extension. That answer your question, David? Cool. Well, unless anybody has something last minute, I guess we can call it good for today.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question regarding your last comments. I think it will be a great experience to have a one-liner to create the cluster, install the CNI and everything like that. But I was wondering, since I'm kind of new to the project, why don't we have that experience with Clusterctl? Is it because there are way too many differences across providers?
Yeah, that's part of it. Since Clusterctl obviously has to support all providers, it's ended up in most ways being sort of the least common denominator of all those workflows. And so, if you follow the quick start, there's several things that you just kind of have to cut and paste and do separate commands and all that. And I guess you could imagine Clusterctl would grow and embrace some of that provider specific stuff, but so far it really hasn't. Like, that's all left up to you to do, and Clusterctl just has the generic commands. But it's a really good point you made, because I don't want this to just, I would like this to ideally someday spawn, oh, that could go in Clusterctl and we should port the feature over there, and then everybody can benefit from it rather than just Azure users. On the other hand, there's always going to be some kind of Azure specific best practices that we know of. Maybe you should always use machine pools at some point and forget about machine sets or whatever it is. And that would be something that would be appropriate, I think, to capture in the defaults in AZCAPI so that people don't go wrong. Cecile, you raised your hand, sorry.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, and on top of that, what you just said, Matt, I think there was a discussion in Clusterctl to have like some sort of provider plugins at some point. That hasn't really moved forward, but the way I see this could potentially be like a POC that eventually ends up being like a plugin for like the Azure provider in Clusterctl. And the way that you built it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's mostly like using Clusterctl underneath, right? So it's not like it's rewriting Clusterctl, it's just extending it and adding stuff around it.
Yeah, basically we just wrap the commands is mostly what it does. I think that would be great. Yeah, if we had a mechanism for provider specific plugins to Clusterctl, then this probably wouldn't be necessary.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Let's call it a happy Thursday, I guess. And we'll see everybody here in another 2 weeks. Thanks for coming.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for the discussion.
Yeah, good stuff.
Bye.